Hello and welcome. In this video I will be giving you a walkthrough of the level and explain the different design methods I've used. This experience is inspired by the movie Nightcrawler. Like the main character in the movie, you are a Nightcrawler, a sort of crime journalist who makes a living from recording crime scenes and selling the footage to the highest bidding news stations. You know barely any bounds and you'll do whatever it takes to get that footage. The level begins inside a city diner. You've just finished a meal and are about to leave, and your red car is parked outside. I've placed a wet floor sign on the ground to lead the player clockwise through the diner. This way they'll see the car easier, and I framed it through the window. Going outside, the parking lot leads the player straight ahead. This is important for the coming gunshots event. I've also focused the player's attention by placing trees on either side of the window that block sights of irrelevant clutter. Hearing and seeing the gunshots in the apartment, the player's mission now changes from going home to getting in there and getting footage of the scene before the cops arrive. I've intentionally put a light by the main entrance door to bait the player forward. The door is locked, but there's a cable leading from the door that the player might follow. Doing so leads the player toward an alleyway around the corner. The cable is broken, however, so that won't get you anywhere, but there's an open window on the other side of the wall. I'm establishing a visual language with the player by placing bird poop on ledges the player can and should climb over. This one is too high at the moment though, so the player must find a way to reach higher. Climbing over the wall acts as a one-way valve that prevents the player from going back. This helps create a sense of progression and lets the player know they're going the right way. This one-way valve will become relevant again later in the level. Using the same kind of bird pooping as before, this back alley is designed for the player to find a climbable way up to and through the window. While inside the building, the player is prompted to bring out the camera and start recording. This serves two purposes. It increases immersion and makes the moment more intimate, and it brings the player camera closer to the character, making it easier to rotate the camera without hitting walls and edges in this tight and narrow space. I use environmental storytelling and triggered events to keep the player engaged, like the stranger in the elevator and the blood on the floor. Entering the apartment, the player gets a slow reveal of the crime scene, only revealing parts until they've fully reached it. I've also framed the dead man on the couch through the kitchen wall opening. Just as the player reaches the crime scene and records it, the cops arrive. The player must now make their way out of there and get back to the car, without getting caught and mistaken for the murderer. As you leave the apartment, you can hear cops heading up the same stairs you came from, so you must find another way out. There is a similar way out on the top floor, for those of the players that run that way instead. This is where the wall acting like a one-way valve I mentioned earlier comes back into play. Since there's no going back that way, the only way forward is an open door, which seems to have been opened by the actual murderer as they fled the scene. Entering this new area, the player finds the first stealth encounter. I made it easy on the player by having them enter the area onto an elevated vantage point with good cover. That way they can take it at their own pace and decide for themselves when they're ready to head in. The player needs to reach the window over by the scaffolding. I've highlighted it with yellow tape that blows in the wind that helps it catch the player's attention. The area has an open design that lets the player find their own way forward. The guards patrol between points that together cover the way forward at different times, so the player has to time their movement and stay on their toes. Entering the burned building gives the player a change of pace and scenery. Since there are no cops here, it also lets the player catch their breath before heading into the next area. This is also a nice vista for the player that lets them take in the area. It also frames the objective, the car. It gives the player a sense of where they are and it helps them with their mental map, and it reminds them of where they're going. Climbing onto the excavator was something I wanted to include as a fun little encounter. Hanging on a ledge just out of the cop's reach plays nicely into the power fantasy of being a slippery nightcrawler. The final stealth encounter starts with the player in a more exposed position than the previous, forcing the player to keep moving. I bumped up the difficulty in this encounter as well because in order to reach the end of this section and beat the level, the player has to use a throwable can to distract the cops. They're actively blocking the exits, whereas in the first one they didn't. So up until now, using throwable cans has been optional and something the player could do to experiment and learn the mechanics. This is the final stretch before reaching the car and getting out of here. We did it. Thanks for watching and I hope you liked it.